I'm going to get right into this one, guys. We're going over the best movements for developing power in the bench press. We are going to look at specifically the ways to develop your upper body neurologically so that you can generate as much force as possible, as fast as possible, to move the most amount of weight off your chest in a bench press setup. A lot of the discussion we've done in the past has been specifically about getting the musculature developed. That's a very, very important part of bench press success, and it gets lost in a lot of powerlifting specific circles. It's just known that having a bigger upper back, bigger biceps, bigger rear delts, traps, front delts, all of that contributes to a bigger bench press. It's going to support greater performance down the road. However, benching and benching alone doesn't necessarily give you all of those things. And that's one of the reasons why so many big benchers in the past have been bodybuilders or have been people who have done a lot of bro style stuff. Eric Spoto was a great example. He was a bench only gym rat who just loved doing a shit ton of work for his upper body. He ended up coming out of nowhere and setting the bench press record. So it's just a testament to the fact that having a bigger, more well-rounded, more muscular upper body, very important for bench pressing. But I've covered that. Today we're going to cover the neurological stuff. This is the tip of the spear. You got the base wide, you've got the development. Now you want to chip that marble down and have your statue of David. You want to have your final masterpiece after you've acquired all this raw material. So we're going to do that today. Now I'm going to break this down into 3 different phases. We have the start of your bench press, arguably the most important. If you can't get the bar started well, you're not going to do anything impressive beyond that point. We have speed or follow through. Now, it's important to learn speed and to put that violent intent into everything that you do. But this is also going to somewhat address what we consider stickiness around the midpoint of the bench press. And then finally, we have the lockout, the very top of the bench. What I generally think of is overload work, because the heaviest poundages can be held when you're all the way at arm's length. And that also has a neurological benefit. So we're going to talk about those together. Thank you to the 122,000 future world champions who subscribe to this channel, and to the 60% watching right now who haven't subscribed yet. If you found any of this helpful or entertaining, please consider subscribing. I put out 4 to 5 videos a week, and you want to make sure you don't miss a thing. So starting out, chapter 1. The start of the bench press. The first movement we're going to talk about is long pausing. This is one of the easiest things to do. It doesn't require specialty equipment. And what it does, it puts you at a disadvantage by eliminating stretch reflex. The way you think about stretch reflex is you're turning your muscle into a makeshift trampoline. So essentially, as your muscles stretch, they get loaded with kinetic energy. And then what happens is they freeze isometrically. Now, muscles are really, really strong isometrically. That's something we know. So if they freeze at the bottom, then they're essentially elastic rubber bands, and they can just redirect all of that energy without actually having to contract. That's a kind of a trick of your nervous system, but that's one of the reasons why you can jump higher when you squat down first and go quickly, and you can jump even higher if you jump off of an elevation like in a depth jump. It's the same reason why when you're new, your inclination is to just rebound the shit out of the barbell, because you actually do put more force on the bar that way. Although it's not the best developmentally, good way to tear a pec, so I don't recommend that. By getting rid of that stretch reflex with something like a long pause, stretch reflex hangs around for like 2 to 3 seconds. So if you count out 3, 4, 5 seconds at the bottom and then hit as hard as you can, the stretch reflex is essentially gone. You also have more time where you are under tension, where all those muscles are stretched out. And that is in and of itself fatiguing. So you get kind of a 1-2 punch that way. It also makes sure that if you're a powerlifter, you're extremely comfortable with the press command. You don't have to have all of your bench pressing around long pauses. In fact, I recommend that you don't. But if this is part of your training, if it pops up anywhere, you're going to be so comfortable with the start command. And when you do go back to shorter, like 1 count pauses, where stretch reflex is still actually stored up a little bit, you're going to be just disgustingly explosive. Now, the second movement is a dead press, and I've been doing a lot of these lately. I'm a big fan of pin presses, especially when you start from the bottom. Again, because starting from the bottom, there is no stretch reflex whatsoever. You don't get any remnant of it. You are going from a complete dead stop. And it's also a little awkward. And I think that does actually add something to it. You have to really think about how your wrists are broken back, where your elbows are. You have to make sure that you're in your strongest position. So it makes you very aware of that early on. But as you move through pin presses, going from a dead stop, you really start to get a sense of where that purchase comes from. And you're going to notice yourself braking a little faster every time. And you'll even notice that because, again, no stretch reflex, when you do brake, even when you get a good one, because some of them, they'll like skip forward, they'll skip back on you. Even when you do get a good one, you're like, oh, that went really well. You'll be like, why is this moving so slow the entire way up? So you have to hit the gas the entire time to get it going. That is pure neurological development, and that is great for conditioning starting power. Now, the third one is a Spotto bench press. Notice that we're just kind of finding ways to disadvantage you at the start. We're taking away all of your advantages. We want these movements that actually force you to handle less weight at this point, because conditioning to those is going to make sure that you are much stronger, much more powerful when you are in your best, strongest setup. So a Spotto press does that by removing the contact point of your chest. You're forced to stop and change direction just a little bit above your chest. Now, everybody, when they start benching, looks at the person that doesn't touch their chest. First thing you think is, oh, you're cheating. Well, bodybuilders knew this for development, that it keeps tension on the muscles so they would get more growth, more development from doing that. But also, strength athletes notice that having to change direction with the bar not even touching, coming within like an inch of your chest but not touching, requires more effort, more support, and it conditions a very aggressive start. So once you get the benefit of that little extra stretch, once you get the benefit of that rigid stopping position with the bar actually touching your chest, your starting power just gets stronger. Forcing yourself to just gently touch your chest or to stop just a little bit short and change direction is just a great way to condition a really nasty start. Now, the next one is kind of 2-in-1 because it kind of does the same thing. That's either going from a deficit, which you can do if you have a cambered bench bar, or a little hack, you can actually do it if you have fat grips, especially if you have the thick ones. That will give you just a little bit of a deficit, and you don't need a lot with a bench. If it's an inch, that's a lot deeper than you're going to experience with just a regular bar going to your chest, and that can mean the world developmentally from somebody who's not used to doing that. So incorporating deficit benching is a great way, just like the deficit deadlift conditions a strong start on the deadlift, a deficit bench is going to do the same thing. Also, kind of the counter side of this coin is going with a flat back. Now, this is really going to apply mainly to people that are used to getting kind of a high arch, really getting their shoulders back, really kind of pushing up into the bar. If you soften that up a little bit, what you're going to notice is that everything has to go through a wider range. That's your contest setup. It works because range is limited. So just by softening up, then everything's a little more disadvantaged, and it's essentially the same as going through more range of motion. I know a lot of people have been pushing Larson presses. I've heard Bald Omni-Man talk about them quite a bit. Great example of that. It disadvantages you at the start, and when you get comfortable with that instability and that kind of relaxed back position, once you get into a competitive setup where you're tight, you have that compression, the start just goes off like crazy. And then the last one we have here is wide grip. And I like wide grip because it is good for strengthening the pecs. I mean, if you're not used to wide grip, you do a couple light sets, your chest is going to be sore for quite a few days, let me tell you. I also think it's really good for strengthening the pec tendon that goes across the shoulder, because as everything gets so spread out, this part of the pec tendon is very exposed. That's where most injuries happen. And going wide under control with a reasonable amount of weight, it is very awkward. So you're still conditioning that neurological hit to get the bar going in that really awkward position. But it does strengthen that tendon, and it does work your pecs just a little bit more. I mean, that stretch you get at the bottom, having your hands out wide, I mean, you can almost think of it like a chest fly at the bottom. That is a very exposed position, and getting strong in that position is just going to mean that you're going to be like a coiled up spring when you go back to your competitive setup. Guys, if I can help fund this channel and help you solve a problem, I call that a win-win. So please allow me one moment to preach the good word of Boost Camp. I tend to get a little complex when I'm writing workout plans. Tracking progress for these programs is hugely important, but options were never great. I would write these long, complex progressions by hand into a notebook, or I would carry a binder filled with spreadsheets I printed off of LiftVault. That's why I'm here to introduce you to Boost Camp. Boost Camp is the easy way to track training progress directly from your phone. Their library of programs features countless dozens of powerlifting and hypertrophy-specific programs from your favorite creators, including Jeffrey Verity Schofield, Johnny Candido, Eric Helms, Greg Knuckles, Alberto Nunez, and of course, yours truly. Boostcamp also has exclusive programs that you just won't find anywhere else. Select the one best suited to your needs and watch the sets, reps, weights, and exercises populate automatically. Don't guess at that one weight you lifted that one time for how many reps again? Have your log of training with you at all times for easy reference in the convenience of your phone. Not only does Boostcamp have a stellar product, but their support is the only reason this channel exists. So thank you, the viewer, and thank you to Boostcamp. Check it out today. The link is in the description. Now we're going into chapter 2. We're focused on speed or follow through. We got the bar started. Now we want to be able to ram it through the entire way. The first exercise, this shouldn't really come as a surprise to anybody. This is a slingshot. Now, one of the reasons I like the slingshot for speed is because it forces you to go through the full range of motion, and it still gives you the benefit of something like accommodating resistance, something like bands, and it really overloads the top. But because you are contained in this tight elastic thing, it forces your elbows in, and it forces you to control the bar on the way down to stay in the pocket, even though this elastic band is kind of, you're fighting against it, right? So it forces you to stay engaged, but you get the benefit of going through a full range of motion. So all of that overload, it's superior to something like a board press because you go through the full range, right? You get to practice accelerating. So it's not just that we're going where the weight is heavy, we're going through the full range, practicing picking up speed and punching through when the weight gets heavy. It's one of the big benefits of accommodating resistance. So the slingshot is just super handy, super easy to set up. Hate to give Mark Bell too much credit, but that was a pretty nifty invention, and most people don't do accommodating resistance with bench. Not that you should really focus too much on it, but it is a useful tool, especially when you're peaking that neurological adaptation in a strength phase. But most people aren't doing a bunch of band or chain work, especially if you're training like corporate gyms, because it's just such a pain in the ass to set up. This is a really easy way to fix that. So my recommendation is to come down, have your competitive setup tight, paused, wait for it, and then know exactly where that moment is where you're going to punch. And your goal isn't to coast. Don't do just enough to get it to lockout. Your goal is compensatory acceleration. Drive that sucker all the way to lockout as fast as you can. Get comfortable conditioning your body as it feels weight. It doesn't slow down, it moves faster. Slingshot is a great tool for that. Now the second one are bands and chains. They do the job just as well. The only difference is they're just 10 times more of a pain in the ass to set up. Now the benefit is that you don't have your elbows being cranked into some way that might seem counterintuitive or might not be aligned with how you generally bench press. So it might be worth it to you if you are a very serious bencher and you bench with more flared elbows, or you don't like having that point of force right at your elbows that's coming in. Bands and chains have been used for a long time. I've even used them with some success. I don't recommend you becoming overly reliant on them. I think they should be included as specific phases of training where you are trying to get this benefit, and they have to be done with straight weight. That's really important that you don't just do banded work, because you'll be getting a lot more work at the top end, but you'll be getting a lot less work at the bottom end. Your strength off your chest will atrophy if you only do band work. But again, just as good, if not better, as a slingshot, provided you have the proper way to set it up right. So that's a big point of concern. Make sure that you know how to set it up right. You're not getting crazy with the tension at the top. And again, you're following through. You want to slam to lockout if you're putting on band tension and you're slamming it up and you're just getting stapled like 2 inches from lockout. That's no bueno. You want to practice getting that full extension, just point A to point B, going off like a gunshot. Now, number 3, I believe I've recommended this for deadlifts before. Josh Bryant made these really popular. That is iso pin pushes. You've seen like Johnny Jackson doing it with deadlifts, where he pulls against the pins like mid shin or at his knees as hard as he can for 5-6 seconds. And then usually Josh recommends you go into contrast work, where you immediately go to like speed work with the full range of motion. So someone like Johnny Jackson, you know, he do that pull for 5-6 seconds as hard as he can, which is a lot harder than it sounds. And then he would go in and do some speed pulls with like 405. Well, for benching, it works exactly the same. For speed, for follow through, I recommend putting it mid press, somewhere around where your stick point might be if you do get stuck there, but somewhere mid press. It's a little awkward to set up. You got to get the pins just right, but you're going to take an empty bar. And I don't recommend jerking. Don't try to break the squat rack off the ground, but take even tension out until you're cranking on all cylinders. Once in your mind, you're like, yes, this is as hard as I can push. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 6. then release tension, rack it, and I recommend contrasting that if it's reasonable to set it up with some type of rep work, maybe speed work. It should be a little bit heavier than kind of true blue speed work, but something sub-maximal, something where you can put some speed on it. Now, what you're gonna feel, you're gonna feel like you have an extra gear. You're gonna feel like the bar gets from your chest to the midpoint, and then once it hits the midpoint, it's gonna just float to lockout. It's gonna feel stupid, it's gonna feel weird. That's what we're going for. And the more you do it, the more you're going to condition that response, so your body's going to do it automatically. And that's what you want. You want that second gear right at midpoint, so you transition seamlessly from the start to the lockout. You want that to like blend into just one movement. For those of you that have ever done this as a kid, maybe you experimented with this where you got into a door jam and pushed your hands out into the door for like 5 or 10 seconds as hard as you can. And when you step out, what happens? Your arms float up. Exact same thing. We're priming your nervous system. We're teaching it. No, we're forcing it to do this exactly when we need it to. And that's how we absolutely top out our strength in a very strength and power focused cycle. The last tool in your belt for focusing on speed and follow through is eccentric overload. Now, the reason this comes last isn't because it's not effective. It absolutely is. I primarily recommend this for more advanced benchers. If you're working on your first like 275 bench, I'm not recommending this, but if you're getting ready for a contest, if you're at least an intermediate, this can be a good way to supercharge your peak. The thing is it's a pain in the ass to set up. There aren't a lot of good ways to set it up, and usually you can only use it for singles. What you're going to do is load up more weight on the eccentric portion and have less weight on the concentric portion. So there's examples of football players doing this where you have, let's say, 3 plates at the top, you're lowering it, you get to the bottom, your buddies take a plate off, and you go right back up, and you're maintaining tension the whole way. So one, you got to have buddies to do it. You got to trust them. They got to have some timing, and it's really not viable to do for reps that way. Now, the other option is to do something like weight releasers, which a lot of gyms have. Very few use them because even those are kind of a pain in the ass to set up, but that's the best option. That's where you hang the weight releasers from the bar and it's set up so that by the time the bar gets to a certain point, the weight releasers fall off and now you have less weight to push back up. That is also a very viable way to do it. I'm sure there's some other wizardry that some pros have rigged up that works really well. I haven't really come across it, but remember, we're always stronger eccentrically, and our ability to put force out on the concentric is based in no small part to how much force we absorb on the eccentric. It's just like the stretch reflex explanation I gave earlier. It's one of the reasons that someone like Cal Dietz came up with his triphasic system, which actually has athletes go through periods of dedicated eccentric work so that they can absorb more weight on the way down. And they go through isometric work. And then finally, once they're really strong with eccentric and isometric, then they focus on changing direction quick. And that applies to shot putters, that applies to like linemen. And that's how you get a ton of power. Your ability to absorb weight is directly correlated with your ability to reflect that force back out. So now we're in the final chapter, the lockout. This is something that everybody knows. I feel like people learn this very early on. It's like, oh, you want a strong bench, you got to have a good lockout, you got to do your lockout work, bro. And they're not wrong. Again, the most important part of the bench press is the start. So provided that your start is good and your follow through is good, the lockout is less likely to be an issue. But it is possible, especially on a sticky lift, that when you're mechanically really strong, you still miss the lift because you don't have that extra gear built in. And also, handling weight at arm's length, because you are mechanically so much stronger, allows your nervous system to feel a lot more weight, which is always beneficial, even to full range motion. So these are the movements that are going to help the most with that aspect. Now, the first is a board or a pin press. Now we're starting on the top half of the bench. It doesn't necessarily have to be at a stick point. It really depends on you and what your goals are. If you're using it for sheer overload, you can go crazy with like a 3 or a 4 board, and that's going to do the job. It's going to expose you to more weight, but the higher you get in the boards, the more it's going to be like just a heavy unrack. Again, it has some value, but it's going to have a bit less value to anybody who doesn't get stuck literally like 2 inches from lockout. So I do recommend having a little bit of range involved. If you can condition yourself to handle 10-20% more from something like a 2 or a 3 board, you're really going to be working with some firepower at the lockout of your bench press. So that's a good goal to shoot for, is to have an elevated press, but really get to the point where you're using a lot more weight than your full range bench press, and you'll know that that's no longer going to be a weak point for you. The next one is accommodating resistance, but this one is with a twist. This is with a lot more weight loaded up at the top. So we're not so focused about snapping through the lockout. Now you want to be able to grind at lockout. So that means the tension is going to be high enough that the bar really slows down. Now, again, the benefit of something like accommodating resistance isn't just the overload at the top. It's that you get to fire on all cylinders, so you can practice catching the weight with that, let's call it intramuscular momentum. Because you've already started recruiting motor units, you're closer to maximal force production than if you just started at that point from a dead stop. So you can actually handle even more weight if you do it right. And again, you can condition your body to snap right at lockout, to catch the weight and punch through the lockout. So it's a great way to condition really nasty lockout strength. Again, it's a bit tricky to get the band tension just right, but this is an advanced maneuver. And of course, you advanced benchers, this is going to be child's play setting something like this up. In fact, you probably already do something like this around your really maximal contest peak phases. And the last one we already covered, iso pin presses. Again, the difference is we're not doing this mid-range to try and help with follow through. We're doing this at the top to practice grinding closest to lockout. So if you are a guy, and I've known some benchers like this. I remember Leroy Walker was a good example. He benched with a pretty close grip. He'd have the patented thumbs out maneuver, but he would get just a shit ton of compression at the start because he'd get his elbow angle just so compressed, and he would launch the bar up, but his entire bench, and he came really close to locking out a raw 700. He was a nasty bencher, and he came damn close to that really just by virtue of having a big start, but he would miss lifts like 3/4 of the way to lockout. Now, doing something like pin presses against a fixed pin, so like an isometric push, that's going to help, again, get your nervous system exposed to forces that you're not going to feel if you're that type of bencher. Because if you are that type of bencher, you're always going to be limited by that weak spot. So you're always going to be working with weights that you're really, really explosive with. Well, you have the potential to grind a lot more. At the top end, mechanically you're stronger, so you can really load it up. You just have to spend time doing it. And this is a good way to do it without having to load up just an insane amount of weight on the bar. You just need a squat rack that's bolted down, an empty barbell, and you just need to get the angle just right to where you're almost lockout and then just push. Again, this probably works pretty well with some contrast type maneuvers, so I do recommend, if it's feasible, having some other platform set up where you can go and knock off some quick speed or volume reps and really feel the benefit of activating your nervous system with that really intense effort and then going into something full range and a bit faster. So that's it, guys. These are the best variations for developing a ton of power in the bench press. I don't recommend you do them all at once. These ideally would fit in best around a strength dedicated block and would come second or even third to your main full range bench work. Some of these, especially the stuff off the chest, really good developmental effect. You can do these earlier because they're full range of motion, a little more conducive to hypertrophy and to developing the upper body. And the really overloaded stuff is probably going to go a little bit better closer to when you're looking at maxing out your bench. That's kind of the regular ebb and flow. So use your judgment, pick one or two, commit to them. Don't try to do all these because that's not going to end well. And let me know in the comments, if you used these exercises before, how have these played into your peak? Let me know. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Till next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.